time to talk about Temeraire, one of my new favorite dragons of all time, and Throne of Jade is the second book in the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik. I finished this one up last month, and I am going into this review without notes, which means I will be talking about this based more on my impressions of how I felt about it and with what I remembered about it instead of more detailed, which I think is fine for a second book in a series, because once you've read the first book in a series, it's easier to know whether you're going to want to continue on or not. So, I love dragon books. Dragons are one of my favorite magical mythical creatures, and the way that Naomi Novik handles her dragon story is different than a lot of the ones I've read before. If you've read the first one, you know that this takes place during the Napoleonic War. And the French and the English are both using dragons as airships. The dragons have no magical ability. Some of them have special abilities like fire breathing, spitting poison, or whatever. Some are just larger and better fighters. Smaller, faster dragons are used as couriers. So the world and the book just felt a lot more like historical fiction with dragons without that magical, fantastical feel that you often get in a dragon book, which to me was totally fine. My favorite part is the relationship between Lawrence and Temeraire. This one, overall, I did not enjoy as much as the first one. I didn't think it was quite as good, and one of my main disappointments in it was that it didn't have as many of the very sweet scenes between Temeraire and Lawrence when they're going through something and they talk about it with each other and they're like digging into each other's feelings about stuff and just spending time together and chatting. That's all in there still, but it wasn't as much. So at the very beginning, I guess we'll talk about the plot this far in. So after the first book, you know that Temeraire is not a normal dragon. He is special. He had been captured by Lawrence from the French. The Chinese emperor had sent Temeraire's egg to Napoleon as a gift, and Lawrence's crew captured the ship it was on, took the egg, and what do they call it? Saddling? They have a term for when a human has to be there to put the harnessing, maybe. Basically, a newly hatched dragon has to be tamed right away or they've just lost it. It becomes wild, it's only good for breeding and not for military training. And since they were out at sea and there was no one else, it had to be one of those men on the ship, and Temeraire chose Lawrence. And that is a big deal at the beginning of this one when a Chinese emissary comes to Britain to say, "We want Temeraire back. He wasn't meant for you. He was meant for Napoleon, but since Napoleon didn't get him, you have to give him back to us." And what they really want is for Temeraire to just say goodbye to Lawrence. "See ya, I'm gonna go get another human down in China." And neither Temeraire nor Lawrence will agree to this. Lawrence almost gets in big trouble, but they end up agreeing that Temeraire can go if Lawrence can go with him. And then they'll see what happens when they get there. For Temeraire and Lawrence, their hope is that they will get to stay together. They know that the Chinese government wants them to be apart so that Temeraire can have a Chinese writer, or I should say, not writer, a Chinese human life partner. And because the Chinese Empire is so powerful, they could turn the tide of the war if they decide to aid the French side. The British government just goes along with it. They're not willing to make them angry, and so they're willing to forcibly separate Lawrence and Temeraire if necessary. To me, that felt like an extension of the emotions from the first book when the British Aerial Corps sent a different writer to Temeraire, and Temeraire got really mad, but then Temeraire told Lawrence, you know, if you really want to go back to your ship, I'll let you go. And Lawrence is like, well, I'd rather have you than any ship. And Temeraire had, I think earlier, told Lawrence that he'd rather have Lawrence than any amount of gold and jewels and treasure, whatever. And now, in this one, they're in a position where they have to test that. Do they really care about the other one enough to give each other up, or conversely, to fight for their right to be together? And then there's this whole, like, travel sequence from Britain, they can't go over land, they have to sail. And so while Temeraire and Lawrence can go off and fly for a little bit and come back, there's just a long portion of the book that is on ship. And they have like seafaring adventures with some of the tropes you expect in a seafaring book. Nautical tropes, storms and sea serpents and the usual thing. And the British Navy and the Aerial Corps don't always get along very well, and they're stuck on a ship for a long journey. And then they have the Chinese emissary also on the ship, and they don't get along very well, so there's a lot of tension. And Lawrence and Temeraire going forward to face possibly being separated, I felt like it should have been more interesting or more emotionally engaging, and instead it felt kind of boring. I felt like there was too much description of things that didn't matter and too much just like day-to-day ship life that I didn't really care about. When they got to China, it got more interesting. Since their arrival in China is a little farther along in the book, I probably shouldn't talk too much about it because I don't want to give spoilers. But Lawrence and Temeraire have to face that the way they've thought of their relationship and the way that things are back in Britain aren't necessarily what they thought they were. Lawrence kind of has to face what's actually better for Temeraire. I think Temeraire has to decide what he really wants because it's different in China. It's a long way away from Britain and France. The people are different, the dragons are different, the entire culture is so different. They're definitely having culture shock, but not just for the humans, for Temeraire. Dragon culture is different. So I would say first half was the part that I didn't think was as good. Second half got better and more interesting, and I think that second half is setting it up to be better and more interesting in book 3. I have heard other people say that they also prefer the first book over the rest of the series. I think probably because that's when Temeraire and Lawrence meet. That's when they're building their relationship in the first place. And in each successive book, they're not meeting for the first time anymore. They're already a team. Again, no real romance, not much violence. I would say totally appropriate for younger audiences. Still has that kind of classic Jane Austen-y type of writing style. And overall, even though I didn't think it was as strong as the first one, I still liked it and I still plan on going forward with the rest of the series. And I'll probably read the third one in the next month or 2. So if you're reading these, you have time to catch up with me and not have to worry about spoilers going forwards. I forgot to talk about the cover art, and I probably forgot when I reviewed the first book, but the cover illustration is by Dominic Harman, and I think these covers are so cool. I love how each one of these books has one of the dragons from the story wrapped around this little scene in the middle. And I love that it's also on the spine. So when they're sitting on my bookshelf, I can see dragons on the spines of my dragon books. And I love that. And I wish more books did the same. I want to see literal dragons sitting on my bookshelf. Not enough to pay for the Saphira bust though. That's a little much. Thank you to my patrons. I appreciate you guys. I will put a link to my Patreon and my Instagram in the description, as well as the author and illustrator for this book. And happy reading. Bye.